Today's topic is nationalism and development in Asia. Hello, everybody. Good to be with you once again. Today, we are really fortunate to have with us a true scholar, a professor, Professor Prasenjit Duara. He's not an economist, but he knows quite a few things that matter to economies and to economists. His specialization is Asia. Let's listen to him. Over to you, Prof.
Thank you, Subodh, for inviting me to this, what's it called? Vidped, right?
Yes.
Okay. And so, as you have said, I am not an economist, and I do a lot of sort of more conceptual and but also historical. And this paper was originally written for a United Nations volume, although I think they didn't expect it to be that conceptually oriented. But let's see how it goes. Okay, so the topic, as you see, is nationalism and development, and I will just talk through some of the points that I make. So one of the most important things to understand about nationalism is that while we are taught that it is a please don't feel obliged to read the notes, because they're really more for me, and you'll be hearing whatever I have to say. So as I was saying, we are taught that nationalism is a good thing, and for very good reasons as well, because it is what demonstrates that the community of the nation should be growing and developing in all their different dimensions, and so on. So that is so in that sense, it has been very good for growth and for development. But we also see that nationalism is the source of some of the most important problems in the world. And today, these problems cannot necessarily be solved by the nation, or as I say, the nation form is not suited to solve them. I'll return to these issues of the environment and the climate crisis and what is called the Anthropocene, which essentially means, for those of you who are unfamiliar, means the kind of climate crisis has been caused that we are faced with now. In fact, it is happening today and these days as we speak. This has been centrally, typically human-made, are man-made crises, in the sense that we are now a force that affects the geology. For the first time in the history of the planet, for the first time, we humans are in fact affecting the geologically and climatologically the planet.
Yeah.
So, this Anthropocene is created, I would say, largely by competitive capitalist nation states, and I believe today that 95% of the nation states are competitive and effectively capitalist. Even a place like China is driven by GNP growth, right? And I want to emphasize that it is GNP. So there's a gross national product rather than gross domestic. And we'll think about that later as well. So my purpose here is to focus on the double edge of nationalism, which is led by nation states, and I'm talking particularly about particularly in post-war Asia, East Asia, Southeast Asia, and South Asia, of course, India, and the areas around what is called South Asia. But not so much in the Middle East and northern parts of Asia, such as the Central Asia and so on. On the one hand, many nation states, as I've said, have successfully used nationalism to achieve high levels of growth and development. But nation states, how do they do this? They seek to homogenize the population through education and culture to remain loyal to its goals of growth, but as well growth often through global competition and enhancement of state power. But the nationalism of the nation state, while on the one hand there is a growth of the community of the nation, but the nationalism of the nation state also seeks to integrate the nation, or if it cannot, and usually it often focuses on a national core. And for instance, in India, we have today, in Germany in the mid 20th century, you had this Aryan idea and opposed everybody who did not believe in the Aryan idea. But in India today, you have an emerging focus on Hindutva and so on. And so nationalism, I think at core, all nationalisms are based upon an exclusivism of the self versus the other. There is always a self versus the other. Now, as I said, all nationalisms reveal this common underlying structure, and they appear, this self-other distinction appears variously, expressed variously in different countries at different times and so on. So what scholars of nationalism have talked about are two types of nationalism. One, or they used to talk about that. One is a civic nationalism, and the other is ethnic nationalism. And this was talked about in the post-war era, especially to contrast a wartime nation state like the Nazi Germany or Mussolini's Italy and so on, and they were seen as ethnic nationalisms, right? They exclude everybody who's not the Aryan German, or who's not an original Roman and so on. And then there's civic nationalism, which was thought to be the nationalism of the Anglo-Saxon states and the French, that this is much more inclusive of everybody within the national territory, no matter your ethnicity and so on, right? So that was thought. And so stable development was often thought possible through inclusive nationalism. And the exclusive nationalism was seen to be bad for, if not the people themselves, bad for everybody else, including the people they're competing with, right? But I have always argued, and now I think we're seeing it more and more, that these two dimensions of nationalism, the civic and the ethnic, are really two sides of the same coin.
Wow. Yeah, that's a good thought. Yeah.
Well, they are in a sense. I mean, look at today. I mean, if we talk about Nehru had very much a notion of secular civic nationalism. Nowadays, it's popular to denounce someone like Nehru, but he did have that idea. Whether or not it worked, that's the whole point, right? Some people think that you have to switch to the other type for you to become more successful in the growth of your own nation and so on. And look at the US today. It's very much in danger of becoming a Christian white nationalism, right? This is the issue we're posed with. And the US was for the most of the 20th century seen as very much the model of the inclusive civic nationalism, right? So you have these two sides, and at different times you have the emergence or the flaring of this kind of core ethnic nationalism. And this has to do with what I said before, that the nation state is also very interested sometimes in pushing this core nationalism because maybe it's failing in other dimensions. Maybe it wants to succeed in certain dimensions, and it does it by pushing this type of nationalism. So this is result, and as I said, they often do it, or it is provoked often also as a result of dissatisfaction with adverse results of growth, right? And there are many also adverse results. And also because the state is always trying to centralize and homogenize in the nation, right? You want to make it a core people who are descended and belong to this territory, have always belonged from the beginnings of time, right?
Yeah.
So, there's a great quote that I always like to. So there's one more dimension of this nationalism that I'm going to talk about. Great quote from Lord Acton of the late 19th and early 20th century, who said, he was, of course, an aristocrat and opposed to nationalism. He said that the worst enemy of nationalism is the theory of nationalism, right? Because the moment you have someone saying, oh, this was always our land, and, although you may not fit in very well, or you may not get the goods of development, you're still part of this land and so on. But then these people say that, no, the whole idea that we are part of you is not the case. The world now works with whoever has the rights to declare their own. So it's really a theory of national rights that tends to subdivide and reproduce itself a lot. And of course, we've seen this very much in a place like India, but you see it in almost every country, except for the moment in the US right now. Nobody, as I know, there was a type of Texan nationalism or something at one point. Yeah. But right now, almost every country, I mean, you look at Scotland, and you look at all kinds of places, Barcelona, I mean, what is it called? Catalonia. Yeah. So, or you look at Tibet, or you look at Uyghur nationalisms and so on. So nationalism reproduces counter-nationalisms. So they always have a new self versus other, right? And I'm from Assam, so I also know this from sort of my personal friends who have always thought that Assam was always different and should assert nationalism and so on. Yeah. So far we are talking only about, mainly about nationalism. But I want to say one thing, and that is very important to understand both development and this kind of ethnic or racist nationalism. The emergence of the very idea of nationalism, which was actually sanctified or legitimized initially by the French Revolution, but it was building up in Europe before the French Revolution. Yeah. European nationalism was based on a religious sense of self versus other exclusivism. This has to do with the fact that in the 15th, 16th, 17th century Europe, you had these great religious wars, and these were wars between Catholics, the Roman Catholic Church, and different types of Protestants that emerged, whether it was Martin Luther or Calvin, or, in the Anglo-Saxon, in England, you had their own kind of religious identity and so on. And what happened there was a big historical transformation. The European society was based on the idea of the sovereignty of the church, of God and the church. And then it began to fall apart in the medieval period, and especially with the emergence of Protestants and so on, they began to separate from the church, and these led to these religious wars. And what was involved here is that, in the Abrahamic religions, they believe in one God and one truth. Yeah. So, and what happened with the Reformation in 16th, 17th century Europe is that the state and the religious community, whether you're Calvinist, Protestant, or certain type of Catholic, becomes integrated. Yeah. Right? The identity of a religious believer becomes identical with the identity of the community as a chosen people. And this becomes integrated with state power and becomes a kind of proto-nationalism. So this was sort of effectively it also created different states which became sovereign. And this was ultimately a result of the Peace of Westphalia in 1648.
Yeah.
And a new relationship of people, church, and state began to enhance state power. And the people within the state, within this religious community, this what we call a confessional community, saw themselves as saved and the others were damned. So it was okay to get rid of the others if you wanted to as well.
Yeah.
So and this became then caught up with, as these states emerged and, European mercantilism and capitalism began to develop, it all got tied up. And this community of people got tied up with all competitive a search for resources. First, Christopher Columbus, people think that he went out to get spices. One of his principal reasons was to go and convert everybody to Christianity, because it was, or if you didn't believe, then you were gotten rid of, because there was going to be the apocalypse, and he really thought the apocalypse was coming and could only be saved. So this religious element was a very strong element there, which has often been ignored in the historical study. But it got very much tied up with overseas colonialism, mercantilism, and capitalism, and this became the basis of the state of one people. Now, the thing, I haven't explained this enough because, of course, it'll take about an hour to explain, but you get the sense, right? I hope. Okay. Now, Asia, when by the mid to late 19th century, the different Asian societies, like in British India or in China, which was also dominated by imperialism, they began to realize that you need to have not an empire with different identities, people belonging either to their religious group or to their lineage or to their local communities and so on. They began, early nationalists began to realize that you needed a strong nation, something homogenized, a strong nation, and to imitate the model of the strong nation through this process of confessionalization and sacralization of the nation, right? Have one belief, come together and see yourself. And of course, this becomes very clear in India in the 19th century. You want to, but it's not just India. You have it in the idea of, and this is also telescope, because of course what Europeans had over 3 centuries,
right.
And ultimately they did develop, a community of Protestants, for instance, but then had this idea of secularism, which meant that you let your minority live in some kind of peace. Of course, it was never fully achieved, and that's what the Nazis wanted, to get rid of all their minorities, right?
Right.
So there was secularism, but in the Asian societies, all this was telescoped. Both the sacralization, the religionization, the confessionalization of the nation happened at the same time that they also thought they needed secularism, because secularism by the 20th century had become an ideal of certainly the dominant nation states, Britain, France, and the US.
Yes.
But you had this underlying element of kind of religiosity, whether it was a Shinto, in Japan, Hindutva, which began to emerge already in early 20th century, late 19th, 20th century India. Maoism also had a kind of religiosity, although it claimed to be secular. The processes were very much like sacralizing the party and the nation, right?
Right.
So these are just some pictures to show you. Now, post-war Asian nationalism. So that was the conceptual historical part. Now we get to the actual, what was happening in Asian nationalism. So this is after 1945, after the UN has been set up. The Peace of Westphalia led to a system of a club of European nation states and agreements within them, and then ultimately became a Vattalian system that, okay, we don't interfere with each other, but we can plunder the rest of the world.
Yes,
And
yes,
that is what they did.
yes.
And then by the 20th, after World War I, they created a League of Nations, which included more and so on. And then after World War II, this whole system of nation states became the basic principle of of global society, right?
Right, right,
You
right,
did
right.
not have rights if you were not a nation.
Right, correct.
And that's, of course, what the Palestinians and others are fighting for, right?
Right.
So we should, but at the same time, I think economists tend to see nation states as stable units of analysis. Not just economists, people say. But I think that it is never a stable structure. It is always a moving target, and the nation state is always a site of struggle between different groups which are trying to dominate with their whole ideology and their ideas and so on. And it's often contentious, as we know. It's also often separatist. So now economic development is also about the profile of the particular, the way in which the state is integrated with particular groups as the dominant groups, right?
Right, right.
So it's about the profile of social and political integration by the dominant power structure and its national imaginary, whatever that is, right? So decolonizing nations, especially China and India, started very high idealism, right, in the 50s and so on. And they say they're going to be autonomous and work differently from the older imperialist powers which dominated others and so on. And even China had rights for its minorities, whoever they brought in, whether it was Tibetans, Mongols, or Uyghurs, or the smaller ethnic. So there was an idea of, and in India, we have the idea of inclusive civic nationalism and the secular state with relative protection and inclusive ideals leading to institutional and human development. To some extent, it was because of the nature of democracy. We know that India was much slower than many other East Asian nations in the terms of human development. And this went on, but the secular, the system went on through the 1980s and 90s. Now, other new nations, especially within the American umbrella of the East Asian Cold War nations, right?
Yeah.
They followed different patterns of development than something like India, right? Now, as I can't remember who it was, an early development economist mentioned that India was basically had a socialist head under Nehru and a feudal body, right?
Yeah.
That's how they characterized it. But for me, what the difference is here that, it's not just democracy. Democracy, of course, accommodated some of those feudal elements and so on. What happened in each one of the East Asian nation states is that you had a major land revolution, right? So many of whether it was in China, of course, this happened with the communist revolution, but the Americans began to insist on this kind of structural reform, first in Japan, and then in Taiwan, and in Korea. That in Korea, of course, landlords remained, but they were much weaker than they had been, right? So this kind of basic land revolution never really happened in India in any significant way.
Yeah.
And but this is, I think, a very important condition for the kind of development that you see in East Asia, a sort of a clearing of the old patterns.
Okay, before you proceed, can I ask you about Indonesia? What do you think? Where does it fit? It's the second largest country after India.
Yeah.
Where does it fit in nationalism and, all the points that you have made? Or do you have any thoughts on it? Or maybe...
we can talk about that, sure. Let's can I just talk about it when I get, because I'll get to some of the Southeast Asian
Fine.
nations.
All right, fine. Okay.
But just
I was just curious because you are.
okay, and
It's
that's
the
a good
second
question. I'd
largest
love to.
country, and
Yeah,
it was diverse,
absolutely,
and
absolutely.
they needed to have the strong central power, and they
Yeah,
needed to have a common
exactly,
language.
exactly.
So all those things were there, and anyway, I don't mean to
And
interrupt.
they did have, Indonesia had this huge 1965 clearing of Chinese power.
Yeah,
There were so-called, it was a revolution against, it was a counter-revolution against the communists, right?
yes, yes,
But the bulk of the communists were Chinese.
yes.
So there was a kind of an ethnic.
It was ethnic. It was
It was
ethnic.
completely ethnic.
Yeah,
Although to this day, I remember Probowo and people, Probowo, who also created the Chinese sort of massacre to some extent in 1998, right? After the end of that Sukarno Suharto era.
Yeah.
Suharto era. He led the massacre of Chinese, but later on they supported him because they realized that you had to work within the state structure.
Right.
But okay, so to go back, colonial legacies and the Cold War order. I think this is another point that I make about development, is that there was actually a very basic difference between Japanese colonialism, which developed, of course, much later, and Anglo-French empires. Now, Japanese colonialism was often thought was, of course, shaped by German status. So it was really shaped by the strong centralizing urge that was Germanic and had very close relations with the Nazis and so on. But at the same time, it had this ideology of Pan-Asianism, right? So what it was saying was that we don't want to just treat you as the colonial other. Rather, we want to bring you into an empire and have grow prosperity, right?
Yeah.
And but basically, they did. So on the one hand, they were very cruel. Whenever they saw resistance or they saw things, they just wiped them out, right?
Right.
So and which is the thing that Westerners emphasize. But under Japanese colonialism, the East Asian area which they dominated developed much more than anything in the European, British, and French empires, right? Under Japanese colonialism, 50% of Korea and Taiwan's school children were receiving elementary education by 1940, compared to 2% in Vietnam, controlled by the French at that time, while literacy in India at that time at the time of independence, was only 12%, right?
Right. So this was the Japanese, what was it called? Era of co-prosperity, something like that.
Yeah, the East Asian co-prosperity sphere, right? And so, in other words, they were much more developmental.
Yeah.
And in part, this had to do with their whole different strategy of not thinking of these people as the other, though in practice, they did treat them badly.
Yeah.
But they thought that they could develop as a regional formation, right?
Yeah.
It was very developmentally oriented, partly because of the time, but they were among the pioneers because they were because Cold War, then the same thing kinds of happens, right?
Yeah.
You have these two powers and they say, oh, you're all part of our bloc and we want to create development in our bloc kind of thing.
Yeah.
So in a sense, what I'm arguing is that the Japanese were among the pioneers of this kind of thinking, even before World War II. Now, another example, the accumulated per capita British investment in India, that is per capita Britain's investment in India and Japanese invested in Korea, was respectively $8. So the British per capita British investment in India was $8, and the per capita Japanese investment in Korea was $38 in 1938. So you can see this big, and this was I got this from a Korean, and I don't think it's been translated. It's in English. I don't read Korean. I read Japanese and Chinese, but I have the reference if any of you are interested.
Okay.
Anyway, on top of the relatively good developmental index, then the US dominance over the US basically takes over the area that was dominated by the Japanese.
Right.
And in the Cold War, and it led to continuity in Korea and Taiwan. Investment, aid, the availability of big domestic markets in the US, the export strategies over import substitution that the the former Japanese colonies, now part of US Cold War empire, if that's what you call it, or sphere, begins to get them to develop a lot. Between 1946 and 75, economic and military aid to South Korea and Taiwan were $69 billion and $42 billion in those in terms of in prices in those years, right? Respectively. So there was a huge amount of investments that was going on. And of course, as we know, the markets in the US and so on, they had special access. And although initially they too started with the import substitution strategy, right, which was so dominant in a place like India or China and so on, that built big industrial capital and so on being invested. These guys started that way, but the American strategy was, why don't you do smaller consumer industries, and you'll have our markets and so on. And so this is the kind of thing, this change strategy in places like Korea, Taiwan, Singapore, Hong Kong, where it's led very much to this kind of their development, right? Their high rates of growth. I don't know if I'm presuming too much for some of your, but
it's okay. Let's continue. You're very clear.
Okay, good. So this is the dominant, the Japanese areas controlled, the Japanese empire, the co-prosperity sphere.
Yeah.
Much of, and you see that for about 3 years, most of this lower stuff is after 1942, after Pearl Harbor.
Right.
But they dominated Manchuria, and I've written a book on Japanese Manchuria from, the 1920s even.
Yeah.
And Korea, of course, was even earlier, and North China from the late 30s. And the coastal China, they dominated as well. Of course, they were also hated, unlike the British, who are, loved by India, who were loved by Indians even when they left, although they didn't do that much for India, perhaps. The Japanese, who were so developmental, became hated by and that's another interesting question by their former colonized.
Yeah.
And this, as you can see, is the US sphere, right? The blue is the US sphere. It's interesting that West Pakistan and what was then East Pakistan, which is Bangladesh. But actually, it was really a lot of the Tibetan, the Chinese think that Tibetan nationalist movement in the 1950s was enabled by Cold War, by India participating. But most of the help for the Tibetan nationalists against PRC was coming really from what was then East Pakistan, right? This is also something that is, it's an extraneous factor rather than part of the developmental story, but I just wanted to say this. Okay, so Cold War militarist industrialization in the former Japanese colonies. Within Korea and Taiwan domestically, what was the strategy of development, right?
Yeah.
As we've talked a little bit about the economic dimensions, but thinking of it as a whole developmental strategy, it was a top-down strategy. It was top-down nation status. So the nation state was very involved in this development. It was militarist, partly because of the Cold War, but partly an inheritance of the Japanese style, right? very disciplined and militarist kind of mass mobilization was also part of these strategies of nation building and creating development. But it also created discontent because, this kind of militarist disciplinarity was not popular, and it was very extractive as well, because they needed to extract resources from the people, labor resources and so on. Park Chung-hee, who was the president of South Korea for a very long time, from 1963 to 1979, these were during the takeoff years, was actually a career officer in Japanese Manchuria, which is called Manchukuo, in the Imperial Army. And he was a great admirer of the samurai cult and the Bushido cult, which is the militarism of the Japanese, Meiji Japan, of Japan during and before World War II, right? Chiang Kai-shek of the KMT was also very much influenced by the German nationalist fascist model, but he mixed this nationalist fascist with Confucian and Christian ideological concoction called the New Life Movement. This was a highly surveillanced code of conduct meant to, I quote now, to thoroughly militarize the life of the people of the entire nation. Yeah. It is to make them nourish courage and alertness, a capacity to endure hardship, and especially a habit and instinct for unified behavior. It is to make them willing to sacrifice for the nation at all times, right? And this was very much also part of the Cold War ideology. These people were at the front of the Cold War sort of fight. Taiwan was supposed to recover the mainland from the communists. The South Koreans were also supposed to get involved, get rid of communism and so on. And so this was very much a top-down militarist. In both Taiwan and South Korea, it was the communist other that was without, and those who were considered sympathizers inside were also persecuted. And so this whole military strategy and the Cold War ideology enabled the repression and disciplining of the population in their strategy of development. True. So there's an enormous amount of disciplining. Yeah. And of course, these were, once the Cold War ends, the Vietnam War ends, China and the US have this rapprochement, which begins with Kissinger in the early 1971. Yeah. Then, in fact, the Cold War begins to dissolve, to slowly disintegrate in East Asia. Yeah. Although it was still very important in the European side, right? Germans and US versus Russia, Soviet Union. Here it begins to then and there's a relaxation of US military concerns in East Asia, and dictatorial regimes of people like Park Chung-hee and Chiang Kai-shek and so on. Though Singapore, of course, was not dependent on them. They continued, Lee Kuan Yew. These dictatorial regimes are ousted through popular movements in both Korea. I remember being visiting Korea in 1980s and sort of being caught up in this huge popular movement called the Minjung movement, aiming to overthrow the military rule. So these are ousted in most of these countries. In Korea, in Philippines, Marcos was removed. Taiwan, also, Chiang Kai-shek, the KMT was removed. In Indonesia, and where you had, basically Suharto was very much supported by the US military as well. Yeah. And also led a pretty militarized regime, and they also were. But of course, in the process of their disintegration, because of the lack of US support for so many of these military regimes, it led to, as I said, in 1998, much later in Indonesia, 1998, also to a lot of killings of different communities, especially Chinese, but also others. So, and Thailand also had a huge and they keep having now. Now there's another one going on in Thailand. So separatism also begins to take place in places like Taiwan and Indonesia. And in Korea, there's the opposite direction. Oh, we must get rid of the North Korean regimes, or we must unite with between South Korea and North Korea, right? So these movements now begin to take place and emerge in the civil society rather than in the military sphere. So here are some pictures of this is the kind of disciplined workforce. I mean, not giving you anything very exceptional, but you see here, this is Chiang Kai-shek everywhere, statues of Chiang Kai-shek. I'm not sure what this picture was, whether it's reality or whether it's an art, a satirical art piece. But here are protest movements in Taiwan as well, right? I mean, we could show thousands of pictures, but we're not in that. Nationalism and development in China. I mean, here also we can talk for a very long time, but I will try not to. It's already, I don't even know what the time is. China was, of course, an outlier in the colonial period. It was not fully colonized.
Right.
And as we know, it developed in opposition to the Japanese occupation and Chiang Kai-shek's weak regime of the Kuomintang. It developed a very powerful revolutionary nationalist awakening. So I always remember that the Chinese Revolution was was in fact an enormous social revolution where many millions died, but also a nationalist one. And you became inseparable at some point. And of course, one of the most powerful dimensions of the Chinese Revolution was the party state that emerged, right? It was a type of kind of control through a mobilizational apparatus of the Chinese Communist Party. They took Leninism, the idea that you penetrate into the very core, into the hearts and minds of the people in a way that we have not seen in India. The closest that we came to that, well, maybe now there is with the RSS and so on, but I should also add, on the one hand, this penetration was not just penetration. They would also give the landless some land. They would have some redistributive dimension, was very much a part of it, right? And so that also created a certain identity with the Revolutionary Party. So the rural mobilization, which was to some extent there in India, in the Gandhian Congress movement, but something like, this is where someone like a place like Indonesia could not do. Indonesia did not have a kind of party structure to mobilize the rural population to any great extent until after, and even in Sukarno's time, there was nothing. So it was really much more militarist and ethnic rather than sort of a developmental and a redistributive idea. So as I was saying, it's top down, party down, but it's also, they had micro levels of ritual of identity conversion for support of the party, nation state, and of some redistribution also. And they also were at times, they too sort of reveal this sometimes very flare-up nationalism that would take place, for instance, during the Cultural Revolution or Great Leap Forward or something like that. But at other times, they would also alternate between a more alliance-based, a more what Mao Zedong called the new democracy, which is the idea of bringing together what at some people at some time might become your enemies, like sort of landlords or capitalists, but sometimes you need them, right? So it's under their control that you bring them and you have a broader coalition. And then at different phases, the radical element breaks out, right?
Yeah.
So, but after the liberalizing reforms in China after 1979, Chinese nationalism becomes more expansive to include, but it's a certain type of expansiveness, right? It begins to include a lot of overseas Chinese who, as many of you know, were also responsible for the early massive investments in China, the overseas Chinese, which generated sort of capitalism and growth. But this growth was mostly the early Chinese, the 80s and 90s. Most of the growth was along the coastal areas with the cities and so on. And the inland was relatively neglected. And it is during this period of loosening of nationalist control that you also begin to see separatist nationalisms in China, right? Whether it's ethnic regions of Tibet, of Xinjiang, of Mongolia, and these places you begin to see from the 90s onwards and continuing, and then the subsequent repression of these as well. So in a way, Chinese nationalism becomes much more oriented towards Han Chinese overseas and in the more prosperous regions, and these vast, 2/3 of China, of the origin of the Qing Empire was not dominant, was not Han Chinese. It was all these. If you look at just the surface, not the population, of course, population has always been about over 90%, right? But of Han. So there is a kind of separatist nationalism, and there is a lot of repression also in regions of Tibet, Xinjiang, and so on. And in part, this was because they felt that whatever development was taking place under capitalist growth was not being was going mainly to the prosperous regions, the already prosperous regions of the East Coast, and not coming into the interior. And right now, I think communism, while until Xi Jinping's few years ago, it's very clear that it's nationalism that is dominant, much more dominant. Although now recently Xi Jinping is beginning to assert state control and more redistributive, but nonetheless, nationalism is the dominant ideal. And of course, he is now seeking to assert China's so-called rightful place in the world.
True.
He's also reviving Confucian traditions, right? I mean, but in a sense, these are not working too well, but we can't go into that now.
Right.
Nationalism in India. So, the idea of nationalism and economic nationalism, as we know, was highly developed in India. Even in the 19th century, Dadabhai Naoroji had a theory of drain theory from the 19th century. Although it was not mobilizational in the same way as in China and in East Asia, where, people's lives are penetrated by the parties and they're able to mobilize almost all elements in the population for certain, whether it's for developmental reasons or for war or for a Cold War kind of thing. But Indian nationalism also was mobilizational to some extent, but more surface. And it also, but Indian nationalism also authorized this autonomous development path. And both China and India sought to maintain their non-alliance status, right? And of course, today we're still figuring out whether that would work or not. That can work with the US alliances and the Quad and so on.
Right.
We've said dominant national imaginary was the Nehruvian secular democratic mixed economy. Democracy also permitted deeply entrenched rural elites, as I'd said, the socialist head and the feudal body, and it created a lot of path dependencies, right? So you had entrenched sort of interests that would not permit change very easily. And you didn't have the kind of mobilizing structure that you had in East Asia. So there are multiple interests and constituencies. A legacy of colonial policies of divide and rule created communities, different communities seeing themselves as, as almost equal in terms of loyalty as to the nation state. And this became, of course, problem in India. And also the colonial inheritance, the colonial state was very weak and dysfunctional, and that's what the modern Indian state inherited. By the late 1970s, the developmental model in India which is, as we know, also the license Raj and a few dominant groups. And the redistributive function did not seem to work very well.
Right.
But you did have new urban aspirations by the 70s and 80s, which led to a lot of protest and anger against the government. And also the counter-national movements began to emerge among the Sikhs in Kashmir, in Northeast India, and so on. And from 1991, the political economic pressures and budget crisis led, of course, to a change strategy to what we can call what is it called in India? The reform era or the neoliberal, or what do we call the post-Manmohan Singh era? I've forgotten. Neoliberal, right?
Yeah, no. LPG, whatever, it doesn't matter, we know.
Yeah, okay.
Yeah.
So these become the goals of national development, and growth becomes more important than redistribution. Although soon after, redistribution comes back, and it's the idea of redistribution returns in the 2000s, and but in a very different way, I think, from other East Asian countries.
Yeah.
There's also much greater.
Can I just stop you
there? Yeah, sure. This is exactly your area that I'm poaching into. Yeah.
That term in that parenthesis, actually, it should come out of parenthesis.
Oh,
including more federalism.
Yeah.
But that actually, most people don't realize it. But what the economic reform of 1991 did is that it liberated the chief ministers.
Yeah.
And the power shifted to the states. The power shifted to the states, and the chief ministers became much more important than they were in the past.
Okay.
And actually, today, and now I'm going far beyond this, but, nobody wants to be.
I'm very happy that you are.
You'd rather be a chief minister than the defense minister of India.
But okay, that's a very interesting point.
Yeah.
No, that didn't last for a long time. I mean, there's been a lot of centralization, especially under this government, re-centralized.
But the economic centralism is too late. Anyway, I'm not here to talk. You are here to talk.
Okay, but
let me get out of here.
Hear you about this. Yeah. Okay. So, they had many more. You're saying that the states had control over much more of the revenues,
and not only revenue, decision making.
Decision making. Okay.
It's not so much. Revenue is, of course, a difficult issue because of various constitutional and so on. But essentially, they made the ministers. Let me illustrate it with a very crazy example. Okay. When Enron started to set up its power plant in Mumbai, the famous Enron debate and so on, okay, let us say that they didn't realize this. Okay? So they dealt with the New Delhi energy minister. Okay. After having dealt with the new energy minister, dealt with the way in which Enron deals with such things, let me be diplomatic.
Yeah.
But then the real ruler of Maharashtra is Bal Thackeray. He said, hey, I'm the boss. You have to come. He just said no to the power plant until he said, you come and explain to me why it's good for the people. So the key head of Enron, a woman called Rebecca Marks. Yeah. He wouldn't go to meet her. That was out. She had to come to his home because he didn't leave home. He didn't have an office, right? He's not in political office. So she had to go to his home. And he said, no, you can't have Western dressed women come to my home.
Oh my God. Yeah.
So he exerted his power absolutely and totally. And when she left, he said, she has explained to me how it is in favor of the people of Maharashtra, and he gave his okay to a project that was completely unjustified. But obviously, he had been satisfied with whatever it is that Enron used to satisfy politicians with. The mistake they made was that they went and talked to the energy minister in Delhi, who really cannot do anything other than write policy papers.
Okay, yeah.
So the power had already shifted
Yeah, okay.
to the states, and that's the case today. You really cannot do anything. You need when the previous Maharashtra government was in power, the so-called bullet train from Ahmedabad to Mumbai was held up because they said, no, the train cannot end here. At this point of land in which you are supposed to end up in Bombay, this is not going to be given to you. You can't have it. So you have to find another piece of land in Mumbai where you'll have your ending station. And that was just pure power of the local chief minister to a high prestige, high powered, symbolic national railway project. But he just held it up. He said, nothing doing, the station can't go here. No one could change his mind.
What you're suggesting is that this federalism is actually often anti-growth.
No, it's not anti-growth. That's how Tamil Nadu and Karnataka, the 5 South Indian states have grown, because they no longer have to rely on national decisions. And that's how Gujarat, Modi made Gujarat a powerhouse.
And why it is that now people who deal with Modi always have their projects, their investments in Gujarat.
Well, that's only, I'll leave that out. I'm not going to be the talker here. But what I'm saying is that you need to see the growth, the disparity of growth between my 7A states, which is the 5 South Indian plus Maharashtra and Gujarat, is entirely due to the change in 1991, under which chief ministers could actually make decisions even if they were not of the same party as the prime minister. So Modi in Gujarat essentially realized it, and he turned the power companies of Gujarat into near world class. Because he said, look, it's under my control. It's not under the union government anymore. So anyway, I just want to say that from an economist perspective, most people don't realize it, that it's not the money, but it's the decision making. So that's how Modi could simply tell his power company people, all the discoms, that look, you can't run the old ways. You got to let the technical people run this. And that was it. Gujarat has no power shortage, nothing. It's all done. And that's how Delhi in 2001, they moved to a different model of power distribution, and you don't have power shortages in Delhi. So this decision, and Odisha, Naveen Patnaik has just handed over power distribution to Tata's. On the same day as Tata bought Air India, the newspapers and news media just ignored this major news that they have taken over the power sector in Odisha. And he doesn't need anybody's approval. He doesn't have to pass it through the union government in any way. Decision making is not giving him more revenue. He's making the decisions.
So the states didn't have this kind of decision-making power before 1991?
They didn't have it in the sense that all investment was controlled by the Planning Commission.
I see.
Okay, so you had that key permit license Raj meant where will anything be placed. So when Mamata Banerjee essentially threw out Tatas, and they're from West Bengal, she couldn't throw them out, but she essentially made it very tough for Tata to build the Nano.
Singur,
and then Modi simply said, come tomorrow, I'll give you the land. He didn't even know where the land would be, but he was in control. And he didn't have to ask any permission from anybody as to where the investment can take place. He just said, come.
That's very, very interesting. So it's really this, and it's very, so what was the key policy change, or was it a constitutional change?
No, there was no constitutional change at all. It was simply that economic decisions were no longer controlled by the Planning Commission. Okay, so there was no constitutional change, there was no legal change, and the union government.
Just a policy change.
It was simply that the power, decision-making power, was now the chief ministers could exercise it.
So this was a decision made by Narasimha Rao.
Yes, it is in the 1991 reforms. Because
Okay.
the permit license Raj was the way by which the union government had centralized economic decision
Okay.
making.
Yeah.
You had the unionized, centralized economic decision making.
Yeah.
But that centralized decision making just vanished. Money flow, no. Money flow is controlled by the same constitutional process.
The same division. Yeah.
But but pretty soon, if you developed your state, you had enough local money.
Yeah.
Like Gujarat could build the Narmada Dam.
Yeah.
Even when the World Bank walked out, Modi said, we will build it. And he did.
But he didn't need to get approval from
He needed to get approval.
downriver states.
But he needed all that, but he could finance it.
Okay.
By the time he had enough money that he could finance it.
Wow, the whole thing, how much? It must have cost billions and billions.
But the thing is that once you have built up your state economy, you can finance things. And essentially, that's what the 7A states, which I call the 5 South Indian, that's Gujarat and Maharashtra, they really can finance their own things from their own capital and their own everything. And so that's why I don't want to talk more, because I just want to say that this
sure.
federalism.
You can see this now when Foxconn and Apple and so on come, they go to the States.
Well, there's no choice.
Yeah.
There's absolutely.
So now it's become very clear.
Yeah. So I just want to.
Yeah, no. That was a very important, very important intervention.
But the nationalism has changed, but okay, anyway, let me shut up. It's not my talk, please.
But I think the nationalism has changed and become, so there's a strong federalist element there. But there was also a lot of sort of kind of anger and the transformation, I think, which this was this, I think the very interesting expression of the 1970s was this angry young man, idea that you began to see, that the populace itself sort of begins to defy the state in a way that was not earlier possible. And I think it's part of the same sort of trend towards decentralization at a certain level of the nation. And here again, I think it is in this period that you also begin to get sharp differentiation of state level development, right? I mean, and you get all these backward states becoming even more backward, most of them, because of course, I mean, or at least the gap begins to
rise.
Right? Yeah. Although there has been general uplift broadly, but their gap begins to rise. Okay, so in Southeast Asia and the Near East, just as in China and India, popular dissatisfaction with existing strategies of development and changing ideas of redistributive justice during the post-colonial decades in Southeast Asia forced changes in policies and strategies of the regimes, right? And here, often it coincided with the weakening of US military support. So they too begin to, you get all these popular risings, and you get also ethnic transformations, like in Malaysia, you got this idea of Putri Bhumi, what is it called? Bhumiputra, yes. Bhumiputra ideals, and of course, the similar kinds of ideas happen in Indonesia as well.
True.
And so, but in Southeast Asia has a very interesting sort of developmental trajectory. After the Vietnam War, Southeast Asia, of course, became integrated into the regional economy more broadly, right? Centered in Japan. So Japan became the center of this whole regional economy of East and Southeast Asia, apart from China at this point. And the early generation of what is called newly industrializing countries, what was called then, which was Korea, Taiwan, Hong Kong, and Singapore, they began to get integrated. And a lot of Japanese investment poured initially into the production systems of the regions in the 1980s. And then, when the Japanese economy itself, when the so-called bubble burst in Japan, and there was all this there was a lot of cheap credit in Japan because interest rates had come way down. And this then fueled speculative investments in Southeast Asia. And you had a lot of the money going not into actually something which people have not really noted so much is that there was as many of you know, there was a financial crisis, the Asian financial crisis in 97, 98, right?
Yeah.
During which, and what was responsible for it was that there was a lot of money coming into Southeast Asia. Initially, it was for productive purposes, but then after a while, it began to fuel speculative investments, right? Mm-hmm. And the stock markets began to grow. And these societies didn't have the kinds of modern institutions that could handle all this capital and technology coming in, right? Mm-hmm. But at the same time, why was production not centered that much in these second generation industrializing countries in Asia, like Thailand, Indonesia, Malaysia, and so on, is in significant part because by the 80s and early 90s, or until the mid 90s, a lot of this production had shifted to China already.
Yes.
Right?
Yeah.
And one of the important things that the Chinese did was not to depreciate the yuan. And the Southeast Asians were very happy about that, right? So the Asian financial crisis, which took place in 97, 98, also revealed that there was continued dependence on the US-Japan relationship, even after the Cold War, and insufficient autonomy to control their currencies and so on. So one of the things that I have studied since then is not so much economically, but really through ADB, Asian Development Bank reports and so on, is that ASEAN, which was the Association for Southeast Asian Nations, which was initially created for integration with the initially created for military purposes, right? It was a regional security organization, then becomes more and more economically integrated, and they seek to become relatively autonomous as a regional entity, right? ASEAN. Yeah. And this was quite successful. And in the second global financial crisis of 2008 and 9, not second, but the next big one, 2009 and so on, ASEAN was not affected as much because they had the capacity to control their own currencies and the kinds of investments that were coming in. By the way, you know that, what was his name? The guy who was most in demand for fueling all this speculative, or for channeling all the speculative, was a guy called Rakesh Saxena in Thailand.
I see. I did not know that.
Yeah, Rakesh Saxena. He had to then, when I went to Thailand and they asked me, he then went to Canada to seek, and he was under house imprisonment in a big skyscraper in Canada. And but he had a swimming pool and so on. But the Thais were really interested in it. And I met a Thai professor who said, "Oh, Rakesh Saxena, he's the biggest criminal we seek now." And I said, yeah. He said, "Tell me something. How did he become such a speculator after doing English honors?"
Yeah.
That was the big question this guy had, right? They knew all about him, that he was doing English honors, things like that. So anyway, that was that story of... So in the 21st century, Asian states have accepted the neoliberal order, but it has not reduced nationalism. Nationalism changes the strategy and character in each of these countries.
Yeah.
They favor domestic private corporations, often at the expense of public investment and services. And in places like China, the kind of decentralization that you talk about in India happened in a very radical way. So that now you have provincial governments who are actually the major investors in many of the BRI countries and so on, right? And they also take relatively autonomous financial decisions. Of course, I'm not going to go into growth in trade has fallen over the past years, although there was a lot of growth in global trade. Between 1960 and 2015, world trade, especially after 1990, increased at an average of 6.6% in real terms, while global output grew at an average of 3.5%. Anyway, I'm not sure this is relevant for this, but at any rate, there is a tendency towards much more, as we see now, more nationalization, as we see in the world also, the sort of sort of de-risking from China, right?
Yes.
China became the major economy. Now they're talking about creating separate supply chains or relatively autonomous. I'm not sure it will work, because what I guess I'm trying to say is that global integration is still very strong, even though there's nationalism. And this nationalism, is this is a phenomenon that I didn't explain, and I should at an earlier stage, but it's a good time to also explain it, because in some ways it's very much, the condition we have now is very much like the condition between the two world wars.
Yeah.
Is to say the global economy was integrating, even before World War I was integrating, but because there was so much competition among different big nation states and their capitalist organizations, this provoked a kind of nationalism within these societies at a time of global integration, economic integration, because of what was perceived as uneven or unequal or unfair distribution of global resources. And this is what tends to produce that flare-up ethnic nationalism or exclusive nationalisms and so on. And you begin to see this all over the world again today. Not that I'm suggesting that we're going to have another world war, but it's very similar to that situation, and hopefully we can come out okay.
Right.
So nationalism seems to have come full cycle from the early 20th century.
Yeah.
And nations' efforts to deploy capitalist advance of the nation is primary. And when economic development is not working, they switch to ethnic nationalism. So I read this in the New York Times that despite demonetization and all of those crises, why is there still so much support for the BJP? And they quoted this guy called Kailash Dhoot, a textile exporter, said that Modi's recent policies had wounded his business, but that Mr. Modi's party was still his first choice. When asked why, Mr. Dhoot was quick and curt with an answer. Hindutva, he said, and he closed his mouth firmly, signaling that the discussion was over.
Okay.
So I just now want
to go back to that slide. I'm tempted to ask you a question.
Sure.
Though I hate to interrupt, but I'm tempted to ask a question.
No, I wanted it to be a discussion. Yeah.
Okay, fine. I focused on that thing in bold. When eco-development is not working, nationalism works.
Yeah.
I'm reminded of Pakistan. Are you?
Oh, yeah. I'm reminded of many countries. It's not just Pakistan.
Right.
But
the difference is that I think they are pretty close to a world record of how many IMF loans they've taken.
Yeah.
Emergency loans are more than 20. I think Argentina might be at 22. But other than that, anyway, I'm sorry. Let's continue.
No. That's and in fact, you have a lot of nationalisms all over the world right now, because very often this economic development does not work, and you often want to push this other side to get, to continue your state strength, the strength of the state, right? In a way that's so. And
let me add one more point, okay?
Go ahead.
That some people will actually flip this. They will say that economic development cannot work without nationalism.
Oh, I'm also saying that.
Right.
But I'm saying that sometimes it's also used for the other.
Yeah,
I mean,
I agree. Okay, fine. Let's continue.
yeah, that I was saying definitely doing that.
Yeah.
Yeah, without sort of the urge to compete with others and so on, and to see yourself as an integrated entity that has a destiny to become the most developed, right? Or to
Right.
control most of the global resources or whatever, more of the global resources. I mean, that was what was at issue before World War One and World War Two, when the Germans found that, these other Anglo-Saxons had dominated most of the world, and what was left for us as we rise, right? And so that was there in both wars. It was a very important thing, and there were other rises also. Japan also had the same idea, and it then picked on this idea: oh, we get rid of the European empires and we'll create this other type of imperial nation. So, and I think in many ways, China also often uses nationalism both to encourage growth, but also when it doesn't work, right? So
Yes.
they always have another, and the other. So for a long time, the other was, and lots of smaller others, including India right now. But until late 70s, especially after China joins the United Nations, it was America that was the enemy, and later on Soviet Union, right? And then after the 80s, the whole Soviet Union declines, of course, in target of hostility, but it suddenly switches to Japan.
Yeah.
Only after the 80s, and all the pre-war and the wartime things are brought up, right? And these anti-Japanese riots take place and so on. And a lot of it has economic motivation as well, right?
True.
And so you do have in China a great deal of this stuff. And of course, it's all around now. It's back to anti-Americanism and anti-India.
Yeah.
I mean, recent reports said that, I mean, it used to be that there was a fairly large proportion of Chinese that thought India was a friendly country, or if not friendly, was okay.
Yeah.
Now, 8% of Chinese think that India is okay, is a good country, are in favor of India.
Yeah.
So 92%. Well, of course, one can say the same thing of Indians in relation to China.
Yeah, same thing.
Okay, now I want to go ultimately to my last thing. The Anthropocene, as I have already mentioned, is the outcome of the competitive system of nation states, and I hope I have demonstrated how it is a competitive system. And nationalism prevents global solutions to essential global problems.
Yeah.
From a global perspective, one nation's affluence may be the flip side of another nation's environmental problems, right?
True.
This is not only because of carbon emissions that had been, that there's so much more being taken place by the already, and the over centuries, now over about 2 centuries, you've had carbon emissions that have been principally benefited certain European and American countries and not the rest of the world who have been affected by it, but who've been negatively affected. But now, of course, it's different. It's China, US, and to some extent, India is also responsible for this carbon emission, but also resource extraction. I mean, this is something that we didn't always notice. We always talked about labor and so, but resource extraction is a very important dimension. And more you look at how the whole planet Earth is being dug up for all kinds. There's a verticality now in capitalism, which seeks to dig up the world and dig up underseas and so on to get these precious materials and so on that are so important for the new technology, right?
Yes.
Whether
yes,
it's
yes.
So the system of nation states has caught us also in a kind of methodological nationalism. This is what is called methodological, that we always take the nation as a unit, right? And I wrote a book many decades ago called Rescuing History from the Nation. Why is it that we always do histories of the nation, right?
Yeah.
Why can't we do histories? Of course, now things that was written in 1990s. Now, of course, we do all kinds of different histories, but it's still is the basis of it's what we call methodological nationalism, basic unit of analysis, national measures and indices of growth and so on. Within nations, indices of sustainability measure environmental costs relative to GNP. And it does not matter if environment, or did not matter until recently, if environmental costs grow as long as GNP grew faster, right?
Mm-hmm.
So this is a time when we actually need not only inclusive models, but also cosmopolitan and global agreements and arrangements and empowered arrangements for at least some dimensions of global governance to deal with the planetary crises, chiefly of the environment. And I'll just stop there. And I'm sorry for taking so long, but
No, it's good. We heard you out, and I'm certainly beginning to think of my own ideas. Where do they fit?
I'm happy with that, but I would have also liked very much. I think we've already taken too much time. So many items to discuss with you. Maybe we should. Can you turn off the? Can we stop share, or you want to finish?
No, we can stop the recording at this point. And I think. But before we stop it, I want you, if you want, if you can, to just say your thoughts on all this in the three countries that are of currently large countries of interest, that is US, China, and India. Where is this nationalism? What is it doing to these countries, as opposed to at the nation state in these three countries? Where is it? How is it going? I mean, the crisis in the US, it's almost social and cultural Cold War or civil war, they call it. I never call it civil war, internal war within the country. There is a major turmoil in India within the nation state, trying to go for more modernization, but revival, keep the old. And China, I'm not quite clear what it is. So I'd like you to start with China, because that's the big mystery to all of us. And you are a China scholar. So could you tell us about China?
So China,
where are they headed? There's economic, as you said, Xi has gone back to distribution, state control. What is going on in China? I'd like to hear you.
Right now, one of the most important things that is happening in China, of course, we know that there is also a kind of economic crisis, though I would not agree with what's his name, my favorite economist who writes in the New York Times, who has the Nobel Prize winner.
Krugman.
Krugman wrote an essay recently saying that China is going to be in worse trouble than Japan in the 1990s and so on. I think that is highly misplaced. There's a huge domestic consumer market in China. So let's talk about the economy first. There's a huge domestic consumer market, but it is scared right now. Because so they're not spending as much as they might, but they have the potential to spend. And of course, there is a problem. The reason they're scared is because of the real estate crisis, right? They were sort of over leveraged and were sort of buying, and the population has declined for the first time in Chinese history. The population has not in Chinese history, in 20th century China, the population, the rate of growth has pretty much evened out, right? And fertility rates have actually gone way below 2.1. I think it's 1.8 or 9 or something like that.
And not going to come up.
It's not going to come up. But we're not 100% sure of that. But so those are the things that Krugman was talking about also. But I think that it's a huge market and there is potential for spending. But until recently, the crisis has come about because a lot of this, one of the safest, what was considered one of the safest investments for the Chinese consumer was real estate.
Right.
So, there were professors and teachers and so on who would have 2 or 3 houses or apartments, right, distributed all over, because that was considered the safest investment. And then because of this overbuilding and so on and over-leveraging, this crisis has had an effect on the population, and it's sort of slowing down right now. So I think that is one of the major financial economic crises. But at the same time, because of the COVID scare and so on as well, what Xi Jinping, who was also interested in going back to the original communist model of state control, now realizes that he cannot really go back there fully, right? But what he can do is increase much more party state control over private enterprise.
Right.
So now, for instance, the party has every decision-making board in every company has to have a party member who has a say.
Yeah, it's new.
It's new. It's very new.
Yeah, it's new.
And so what we see here is that Xi Jinping is also to some extent, nervous especially with this COVID and the kind of opposition to the COVID that we saw in December last year, right? And the fact that people feel that the real numbers and figures have not been released and they don't really know what is happening. So Xi Jinping has decided to re-centralize things very much, right?
Yeah.
And he has a vision not only of regaining China's imperial position in the world as certainly the greatest power in Asia until the 19th century, but he also is trying to develop a civilizational image, right?
Yeah.
And the civilizational image is remarkably similar to the East Asian co-prosperity sphere of the Japanese. I don't know if he realizes it or not.
Yeah.
But he has this idea of mutual cooperation kind of thing, right? Yeah. And everybody understands. And, the Belt and Road Initiative is very much now being folded into that kind of civilizational narrative, right? That we have always, this is the Confucian idea that we'll all be part of one great world, and that we can help and cooperate with each other, and we can, do all this. And my feeling is that he has made important, the Belt and Road have made important inroads and investments in countries, although a lot of them have also failed. But and especially in the global South and in Central Asia, the Chinese have a fair amount of control, right? And so they do have an image of certainly a global power, but they're doing it by mobilizing the global South, right?
Right.
And finally, the US, on the one hand, it has this crisis within its society. As we've talked about, we know it's a completely divided society. Everything is either red or blue. And but at the same time, it is also facing the fact that it can no longer be the kind of global power that it is, right?
Yeah.
Now, and so it's making very determined efforts, at least rhetorically and militarily, with alliances to contain China.
Sure.
But right now, they also have these, what is it called? Build Back Better World.
Yeah.
So Biden and the Europeans have something very similar. And the idea is that they will create sources for private investments in the developing world to counter some huge $500 billion and things like that. They have said, but so far we don't see very much of that in the developing world. Most of it is, in part, it's because of the Ukrainian crisis, but unless we begin to see more of that, I think the Chinese are going to be much more influential in the global south. And India, I think, is a very interesting. India is pushing, and especially Jaishankar has this idea of, we are decidedly part of it's going to be a multipolar world, right? And this multipolarity means that India is going to be a power that is always going to do things in its interest and will not be aligned in one direction or the other. Well, right now, I'm not sure that we are fully committed to that kind of multipolarity because of the China threat to India and the US closeness with India, but we'll have to see where that goes. But all in all, this is what I think about the...
Okay, wonderful. But I just thought, okay, where is the US nationalism going? I mean, there's no threat to nationalism in the US, but the identity of that nationalism is now in question.
Very much in question.
Very much in question.
Very much in question.
And that is a distraction from economic growth, as far as I can tell. That it is a major distraction.
I think so.
Prof, you can talk about reshoring and bringing it back and all, but ultimately your eyeball is somewhere else. Your eyeball is not on economic growth.
Exactly, and when you cannot pass a budget because of political things, right? They had such a hard time, right? Right. And now they've been, what is it called? Downranked or whatever to double A.
Okay.
Credit status and things like that. So you're right. I mean, this kind of political dissension that is happening here, this is close to as you say, not a civil war, but...
I long ago stopped using the term civil war. I just call it internal war because there's nothing civil about it.
There's nothing civil, uncivil war, yes. So I see, that's why
internal war. Anyway, I think it's enough for us today. We have learned a lot from you. And let's say goodbye to the viewers. Maybe we can come back to you in another 6 months. And use this not so much, once we have gone through all of this, and then when you have some sharper thoughts on specific countries, maybe we can come back and have you talk about those and see what we can learn from your scholarship on those issues.
Well, as I said, thank you very much. And I think we should also have a discussion. Maybe you can create a separate
all right.
Video
we'll see to that, but this is done for the moment. So let's say bye to everybody.
Okay.
And let me stop the recording. All right. Okay. Bye-bye, everybody.
Bye. Good night.